My daughter's classmate whispered something to me at the school pickup line that I haven't been able to forget for a single day since. She said, "Mr. Harmon, the garage is where bad things live." I'm a pediatric occupational therapist. I've spent 15 years working with kids who have sensory disorders, developmental delays, kids who've been through things no child should ever go through. I know how children communicate. I know that when a 7-year-old uses phrasing like that, not something bad happened, but bad things live, present tense, like it's ongoing, like it breathes, that's not imagination. That's not a phase. That's a child telling you the only way she knows how. Her name was Lily. No, wait, that's what I keep almost saying because she reminded me so much of a patient I had years ago. Her actual name was Faye. Faye Alderman. She was in 2nd grade with my daughter Claire, and she'd been coming to our house for playdates since the fall. Small kid, reddish-brown hair she always wore in 2 uneven braids, like she'd done them herself in a hurry. Quiet in the way that makes experienced adults nervous. Not shy quiet. Watchful quiet. That afternoon was a Tuesday in early March. I was standing by the chain-link fence with 3 other parents when Faye came out of the double doors and stopped. Just stopped, like she'd hit an invisible wall scanning the parking lot. I watched her shoulders drop when she saw me instead of her father. My wife had been the one picking up both girls for most of the year. But she was at a conference in Columbus that week, so it was me. I waved. Faye walked over slowly, and she slid her hand into mine instead of running ahead with Claire like she usually did. That was the first thing that felt wrong. The second thing was in the car. Claire was chattering about something, a project, a friend, I can't remember, and I glanced in the rearview mirror at Faye. She was looking out the window with her forehead pressed against the glass, and her lips were moving like she was counting something. "Faye, you okay back there?" She looked at me in the mirror. "Yes, Mr. Harmon." But her hands were folded so tight in her lap that her knuckles had gone white. At our house, the girls had a snack. Claire went upstairs to find some craft things she'd been wanting to show Faye. I was loading the dishwasher when Faye appeared in the kitchen doorway, just standing there. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Of course." "Do you have a garage?" I pointed out the window toward the detached garage at the edge of our backyard. "Yeah, right there." "Why?" She was quiet for a second. "Then, is it locked?" "Usually, yeah. Why, honey?" She looked at the floor. "My daddy's garage is always locked, even when he's in it." I set down the cup I was holding. "Does your daddy spend a lot of time in the garage?" She nodded. "He says it's his special room. He says kids aren't allowed." I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment, because I've had to explain it many times since, to detectives, to social workers, to a family court judge. It wasn't a certainty. It was more like the feeling you get when you're driving and something in your peripheral vision moves wrong, and your foot finds the brake before your brain has even processed what you saw. Just an instinct. A deep, animal wrongness. "Faye," I said carefully, crouching down to her eye level, "has anything happened in your daddy's garage?" She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were brown with these little gold flecks, and they were absolutely steady. "That's what I remember most." She wasn't nervous saying it. She was relieved, like she'd been waiting for exactly this question. "Mr. Marst, Harmon, the garage is where bad things live." I kept my voice even. I'd been trained for this, not specifically for this, but for the moment when a child tells you something their whole body has been carrying. "Can you tell me what kind of bad things?" She shook her head. "Daddy said that if I told, Mommy would have to go to the hospital forever, and it would be my fault." My throat went tight. That's a specific kind of threat. Not, "I'll hurt you." Not, "Nobody will believe you." It's more sophisticated than that. It targets what a child loves most and makes disclosure feel like destruction. "Okay," I said softly. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to. But I want you to know something. Whatever happens in that garage, it is not your fault. Do you understand? Nothing that happens there is because of anything you did." She stared at me. Then her chin wobbled and she whispered, "Why does he take pictures?" I felt the room tilt. I had to excuse myself. I went into the bathroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the tub for about 90 seconds, just breathing. Then I came back out, finished supervising the girls, and made sure nothing in my face gave away what was happening inside my chest. That night, after my wife got Faye's father, a man named Roy Alderman, to come pick her up, and after Claire was in bed, I sat at the kitchen table and told my wife everything. She's a social worker. Has been for 12 years. I watched her face go through all the same stages mine had. "You need to call," she said. "I know. Tonight. I know." I called the child abuse hotline at 10:47 p.m. I gave Faye's full name, her address, and I repeated everything she'd told me as accurately as I could. The woman on the line was calm and methodical, which somehow made it feel more real. She told me a caseworker would follow up, that an investigation would be opened, that I'd done the right thing. I did not sleep that night. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that the report I filed would join 2 others that had already been made. Faye's kindergarten teacher the year before had flagged some concerning drawings. A school counselor had noted some behavioral changes 6 months ago. Both times the investigation had been inconclusive. Roy Alderman was a civil engineer who'd lived in the same house in Westfield, Indiana for 9 years. He coached Little League. He had a LinkedIn profile with 400 connections. He was not the profile most people imagine when they imagine a monster. He was exactly the profile they should. 3 days after I made my call, I was at work. I run a private practice out of a converted Victorian in downtown Westfield when Detective Ruiz called me. Not the detective I'd expected. Someone from a specialized unit, Crimes Against Children. She asked if I could come in to give a formal statement. I said yes. She told me they were moving quickly. I asked if Faye was safe. There was a pause. "We're working on it, Mr. Harmon." That pause scared me more than anything else she said. I gave my statement that afternoon. Detective Ruiz was maybe 40, with the kind of eyes that have seen enough that they've gone very still. She took notes by hand, which surprised me. She asked me to repeat Faye's exact words 3 times and wrote them down each time separately to compare. "Why pictures?" she asked at one point. "That's what Faye asked me." She said, "Why does he take pictures?" And your clinical read on that?" She wasn't describing something hypothetical. Kids that age don't ask why about something they've only imagined. They ask why about something that's already happened and doesn't make sense to them. Detective Ruiz nodded slowly and wrote something I couldn't see. I found out later, much later, after the trial, what investigators found when they executed the search warrant on Roy Alderman's garage. I won't describe it in detail because some things deserve to live only in court documents and the memories of the people whose jobs required them to look. What I can say is that the garage had been comprehensively soundproofed. There was specialized lighting equipment. There was a hard drive. Faye was 7 years old. The investigation moved faster than I expected and slower than I needed it to. Roy Alderman was arrested on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after I'd made my call. He was at work when they came for him. His wife, Faye's mother, Donna, had no idea. I mean that literally. She had no idea. I've met women who said they didn't know and were lying. Donna Alderman was not one of them. She collapsed in her driveway when the detective called her. A neighbor found her there 40 minutes later, still sitting on the concrete, unable to get up. Faye went to stay with Donna's sister in Fort Wayne while the investigation proceeded. I didn't see her for weeks. Claire asked about her, and I told her Faye was dealing with some family stuff and we'd see her when things settled down. Claire is a perceptive kid. She looked at me for a long time and then said, "Is she going to be okay, Dad?" I said, "I'm working on making sure she is." My wife and I got a call from Faye's family advocate 6 weeks after the arrest. They'd been doing forensic interviews, working with a trauma specialist, building the case. The advocate, a woman named Ms. Okafor, called to tell us that Faye had asked about me specifically, had asked if Mr. Harmon knew she'd been brave. I had to leave the room when my wife told me that. We were allowed supervised contact about 2 months in. The visit happened at a children's advocacy center, a deliberate place designed to feel like a comfortable living room rather than anything official. Stuffed animals on the shelves, bean-bag chairs, a fish tank with one of those little plastic divers at the bottom. When Faye walked in, she looked smaller than I remembered. She had her hair down instead of in the braids, and she was wearing a sweatshirt that was too big for her with a cartoon owl on the front. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me, and I could see her running some kind of internal calculation. Then she walked over and sat next to me on the couch, not touching, just near. "Claire says hi," I told her. She nodded. "She wants to know if you want to come over for her birthday in June." A very small smile. "What kind of cake?" "She said you get to pick." We sat there for a while in the comfortable quiet. Miss O'Coffer was in the corner with a notepad, not intruding. After maybe 10 minutes, Faye said, without preamble, "I thought you wouldn't believe me. I believed you immediately. Most people don't believe kids. Most people should." I looked at her. "You told me the truth. That was the bravest thing you could have done." She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. "I thought Mommy would have to go away." "I know, but she didn't. She's right here. She loves you. Daddy lied to me." "Yes, he did. Adults aren't supposed to do that." She was quiet for another minute. Then, "Mr. Harmon, are there other kids, like me?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without making it worse. Sometimes, yes. Do they know they can tell? Some of them do. Some of them do. Some of them need someone to ask. She nodded, like that made sense to her. Like she was filing it away. Roy Alderman's trial was 8 months later. I testified. It was a strange experience, being in a room with him for the first time since I'd stood in the school parking lot and watched him pick up Faye, that easy wave, that normal dad smile. In the courtroom he looked diminished somehow, which I hadn't expected. He wore a gray suit and kept his hands flat on the table in front of him, like he was practicing being still. His defense attorney tried to argue that Faye's disclosures had been influenced by leading questions on my part, that I'd put words in her mouth. I'd been prepared for this. I described my clinical training. I described the exact phrasing of my questions, open-ended, non-suggestive, derived from forensic interview training I'd received in my professional capacity. I described Faye's body language, her affect, her exact words. The defense attorney asked me, "Isn't it possible the child misunderstood what she saw in the garage? That she may have been confused about the nature of the photographs?" I said. A 7-year-old asking, "Why does he take pictures?" is not a child who misunderstood. It's a child who understood completely and couldn't explain why it was happening. There was a silence in the courtroom. I didn't look at Roy Alderman. The jury deliberated for 9 hours. I spent most of those hours in a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse drinking terrible coffee and reading the same page of the same magazine 17 times without retaining a single word. Guilty on all counts. Roy Alderman was sentenced to 38 years in federal prison. Given the nature of the evidence, the volume of material, the duration, the documentation he'd maintained himself, the judge's language at sentencing was measured and devastating. She called what he had done a systematic violation. She said the word methodical, like it was an indictment in itself, because it was. Donna Alderman was not charged. The investigation concluded she had genuinely known nothing. A conclusion I believe is accurate. She sat behind me in the courtroom every day of the trial, and I don't think she slept once during the entire 8 months of proceedings. She looked like a woman who had woken up in a house that turned out to have been built on nothing. I can't imagine carrying that. After the verdict, she found me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She just stood in front of me for a second, and then she hugged me. She didn't say anything. I didn't say anything either. There wasn't much to say. Faye started 3rd grade that fall. Claire was in 3rd grade too, at the same school. And somehow, through Donna's resilience and Ms. O'Coffer's careful coordination and a school administration that handled everything with more grace than I had any right to expect, Faye came back to Garfield Elementary. Different classroom, different teacher, but the same building, the same playground. The first week, she sat with Claire at lunch. By the second week, she was wearing her hair in braids again. I tell people that detail because I think it's the most important one. Not the verdict, not the sentencing, not any of the official markers of justice. The braids. Because Faye had started doing her own hair sometime during the year she'd been at her aunt's, and her aunt had taught her how to do it neatly, and she was proud of it. She showed Claire how to do a simple one, sitting on our back porch the first time Faye came over for a playdate again. I watched them through the kitchen window, my kid carefully braiding her friend's hair, both of them giggling about something I couldn't hear. That's the moment I go back to. when I need to remember why. Because here's what I've never told anyone, or not more than a handful of people. I almost didn't say anything that night. Not because I didn't believe Faye. I believed her the second the words were out of her mouth, but I spent about an hour after she left sitting in my kitchen thinking about all the reasons this could go sideways. Roy Alderman had a lawyer. He had a reputation. He was the kind of man that Westfield, Indiana would struggle to imagine capable of this, and I knew it. I'd seen it before, professionally, from a distance, the way communities protect their pleasant fictions about the families inside them. I thought about what it would mean for Claire if this blew up, if it turned out I'd reported something that couldn't be proven. If Roy Alderman stayed in that neighborhood and I had to keep seeing him at pickup. I thought about all of it. I sat with all of it for an hour. And then I thought about Faye's knuckles, white in her lap in the back seat of my car, and I picked up the phone. There are things I wish I'd done differently. I wish I had found a way to ask Faye questions sooner before that Tuesday. There had been other moments. A birthday party in October where she'd been unusually clinging. A play date in January where she'd had a meltdown over something small and then apologized in this flat, scripted way that didn't belong on a 6-year-old. I'd noticed, and I hadn't pushed. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself her parents would handle it. Her parent was the reason she needed handling. That's the thing I have to live with, not guilt, exactly. I've processed it enough with my own therapist to know that what I felt wasn't guilt so much as the particular grief of realizing something could have been shorter. The duration of harm is not a fixed quantity. Every adult who notices and pauses is a unit of time a child continues to carry something alone. I'm telling you this, not to be dramatic, and not for any kind of credit. I'm a mandated reporter. Making that call was legally required of me, let alone morally. What I want you to understand is that the decision still felt hard. Even with my training, even with Faye's own words in my ears, it still felt like walking off a ledge. That's the part nobody tells you. It's not as simple as if you see something, say something. It's more like you see something and your whole nervous system tries to give you 17 reasons why you might be wrong, why it's not your business, why this could ruin everything, and you have to push through all of that and make the call anyway. Most people who are positioned to see these things are not trained clinicians. They're neighbors and coaches and Sunday school teachers and relatives who show up for Christmas dinner, and the calculation they're running in their heads isn't simple, but I want to tell you what I've learned. From 15 years in a field that sits right on the edge of this territory, the cost of making the call and being wrong is survivable. The cost of not making the call and being right is not for the child. Faye is 9 now. She's in 4th grade. She still comes over on Friday afternoons sometimes, though not every week the way she used to. She's in a theater program through the city parks department and apparently is very committed to the idea of playing a villain in their spring production, which Claire finds hilarious. Donna has gone back to work. She's a bookkeeper, does accounting for a couple of small businesses in town, and from what I can tell, she's building something. Not what she had before, but something. I still run into Roy Alderman's name occasionally. His appeals have all been denied. The digital forensics from his hard drive were, according to Detective Ruiz, ironclad. There's nothing coming undone there. Last fall, Ms. Ardbreen, Okafor, called to ask if I'd be willing to speak at a training for teachers and school staff. One of those mandatory reporting trainings that happen every couple of years and are usually a little boring and check-a-box. She wanted someone who could speak to the experience from the outside, from the position of someone who'd made the call and seen it through. I said yes. I stood in front of about 60 school employees in a conference room at the district offices, and I told them Faye's story, with her permission. I'd asked Donna, who'd asked Faye, and Faye had said, and I'm quoting here because I want to get it exactly right, yes, tell them that kids tell the truth. So, I told them. I told them what a child's watchful silence looks like versus a child's shyness. I told them about the braids and the white knuckles and the specific horror of a threat that weaponizes a child's love for her mother. I told them that a child who is being harmed will usually tell you, but almost never directly, and that the job of every adult in proximity is to create enough safety that the not direct telling finds its way through. At the end, a woman in the 3rd row, a 4th grade teacher, I think, based on her lanyard, raised her hand and asked, "What if you're not sure? What if it might be nothing?" I said, Then you make the call and let trained investigators determine whether it's nothing. That is exactly what they are there for. Your job is not to know. Your job is to say. She wrote that down. I hope she never needs it. I hope she needs it and uses it. That's the terrible math of this. You spend your time hoping a thing is never relevant while knowing that statistically, in any room of 60 people, it already is. On the last day of second grade, the year all of this happened, Claire's class had a little end-of-year celebration in the gym. Parents were invited. I stood at the edge of the room with a paper cup of lemonade watching the kids run around, and at some point Faye appeared beside me. She'd been at the celebration because the second and third grades shared the gym space, and her class had been invited too. She stood next to me watching Claire do something involving a hula hoop and 3 other kids. "Mr. Harmon," she said, not looking at me. "Yeah? I'm glad I told you." I looked down at her. She was still watching Claire. "I'm glad you told me to," I said. She nodded once, like that settled something, and then ran off to join the hula hoop situation. I stood there for a minute before I could make myself move. There are children right now who are holding something they don't have language for. Children who are choosing their words very carefully in the back seats of cars, or at kitchen tables, or standing in doorways of houses that should be safe. They are watching adult faces for any sign that this might be a conversation someone is willing to have. Be that person, not because it's easy, because it isn't. Not because you'll always get it right. Because none of us do. But because the alternative, the looking away, the telling yourself you're probably wrong, the decision to protect your own peace, that alternative has a cost that someone else pays. Make the call. Ask the question. Be the adult who is willing to hear what a child is actually saying. Because sometimes what they say is, the garage is where bad things live. And they're right. And they've been waiting for someone who would listen. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in any cosmic sense. I'm not someone who leans on the idea that the universe arranges things with intention. But in the plainest, most human sense, choices produce outcomes. Silence produces outcomes. And the outcomes don't distribute evenly. They land heaviest on the people with the least power to absorb them. Roy Alderman made choices. He made them consistently, over years, in a room he deliberately soundproofed so that no one outside it would ever have to know. That's not a man who lost control. That's a man who exercised it, over a child who had no way to stop him and no language yet to fully describe what was being taken from her. The cause was his decision. The effect was Faye, white-knuckled in the back seat of my car, counting something invisible out the window. And then, there was my choice. I want to be honest about this, because I think the honest version is more useful than the heroic one. I sat in my kitchen for an hour after Faye went home, and I ran every calculation a person runs when they're trying to talk themselves out of something uncomfortable. I thought about being wrong. I thought about Roy Alderman's LinkedIn profile and his Little League coaching and the way he'd waved at me in the parking lot like a man with nothing to hide. I thought about my daughter and what it would mean for her if this became a neighborhood thing. A school thing. A thing that followed our family. I am not proud of that hour, but I think it's important to say it happened, because I suspect most people who end up in a position like mine go through some version of it. The instinct to protect your own peace is not a character flaw. It's just human. The question is, what you do when you recognize it for what it is. What I keep coming back to is this. Intelligence without courage is just a very sophisticated way of doing nothing. I knew, clinically and intuitively, what Faye's words meant. I had the training, the experience, the professional framework to interpret exactly what she was telling me. None of that knowledge was worth a thing until I picked up the phone. Knowing the right thing and doing the right thing are not the same act, and the distance between them is where a lot of children get left behind. Faye is 9 now. She's in theater. She wants to play the villain in the spring show. That detail makes me laugh every time I think about it, because it means she's found something in herself that's loud and takes up space, and she's choosing to use it on a stage, in front of people, for fun. That is a child who is healing. That is what healing looks like when it's working. Not the absence of scars, but the presence of something growing alongside them. I think about the teacher in the 3rd row at that training, the one who wrote down what I said and asked the most honest question in the room. What if you're not sure? What if it might be nothing? That question takes integrity to ask out loud. Most people just quietly decide it's probably nothing and go home. She wanted to know the actual answer. The answer is that your uncertainty is not the child's problem to solve. Your job is not to be certain. Your job is to say something to someone who is equipped to find out. That's all? One phone call. One conversation with a school counselor. One moment of deciding that a child's safety matters more than your comfort with the situation. Faye told me she was glad she'd told me. She said it standing next to me at a school party, watching my daughter fumble with a hula hoop, not even looking at me when she said it. Like, it was just a fact she wanted me to have. I'm glad I told you. I'm glad she did too. And I'm glad I listened, not because it made me a good person. I was just doing what any adult in that position should do, but because the alternative, the version of that Tuesday where I told myself I was probably overreacting and went about my evening, that version ends differently, and Faye would have been the one carrying the difference. Pay attention to the children around you. Not surveillance, just attention. The kind that says, I see you. I'm not in a hurry. You can take your time. Because sometimes a child has been waiting a very long time for exactly that.